Meet the deadliest men ever to sit on death row. From brutal killings to chilling final words, we reveal the shocking crimes, last meals, and last moments of the most notorious criminals in U.S. history. Get ready for a chilling ride into the final hours of these killers.
I've met a lot of men who were motivated to commit violence just like me. And without exception, every one of them was deeply involved in pornography, without question, without exception, deeply influenced and consumed by an addiction to pornography. There's no question about it. The FBI's own study on serial homicide shows that the most common interest among serial killers is pornography.
Yeah, that's true.
And it's real. It's true.
Ted Bundy, the brutal killer. Ted Bundy is one of the most notorious names in American criminal history. With over 30 confirmed murders, but likely many more, Bundy was a man who preyed on young women across several states in the 1970s. He would often pretend to be injured or incapacitated, luring women into his car before overpowering them, assaulting them, and in some cases, decapitating them. His crimes were brutal, and his ability to charm and manipulate his way out of situations made him even more terrifying. Ted Bundy was executed in 1989 by electric chair in Florida. Before his execution, Bundy had spent years on death row, all the while trying to deny his guilt and manipulating those around him. However, near the end, Bundy admitted to his crimes, but not without a sense of deflection. His final meal consisted of coffee, eggs, toast, milk, and juice. He declined a special meal, a curious choice for a man who had been so demanding throughout his life. Bundy's last words were simple but haunting: "I'd like you to give my love to my family and friends." A man responsible for such horrific crimes, yet in his final moments, he chose to speak about love. The prison staff who witnessed his execution noted that Bundy requested not to have a hood placed over his head, wanting to see the witnesses who would be there to watch his death. The chilling part of this request is that Bundy wanted to maintain control in his final moments, something he had sought throughout his violent life. Bundy's legacy remains one of the most studied in criminology. His ability to blend in, his charm, and his deep-seated evil make him an enduring subject of true crime documentaries and studies. His final moments served as a reminder that no matter how long someone can evade justice, the truth always comes out in the end. While many found his execution a necessary act of justice for the families of his victims, it was not enough to erase the horrors he inflicted on their lives.
In 1978, Chicago police found the remains of at least 27 bodies buried beneath John Wayne Gacy's house. To this day, Gacy is one of America's most notorious serial killers, killing 33 young men and boys. His sister Karen visited.
John Wayne Gacy. John Wayne Gacy, also known as the Killer Clown, is one of the most disturbing figures in American criminal history. Gacy, a man who dressed as a clown for children's parties, was responsible for the murders of at least 33 young men. He lured them to his home, where he would torture, sexually assault, and then murder them. Gacy's victims were buried under his house, and many of the bodies were found in crawl spaces, making his crimes even more macabre. Gacy's execution took place in 1994 in Illinois by lethal injection. His crimes were discovered in 1978 after he had killed over 30 young men and boys. Gacy's trial was a media sensation, and the public could hardly fathom how a man who had been a local community member, even working as a contractor, could harbor such a dark secret. During the trial, Gacy was described as a man who had a dual personality, charming on the outside, but a predator on the inside. For his last meal, Gacy chose fried chicken, shrimp, fries, and strawberries, a strange mix of comfort food. His last words were equally bizarre, as he defiantly stated, "Kiss my ass." Even as he faced the end, Gacy remained unapologetic, refusing to show any remorse for the countless lives he had destroyed. What made Gacy's case even more chilling was his portrayal of Pogo the Clown, a character he used to entertain children. Gacy would paint self-portraits of Pogo while in prison, adding to the eerie nature of his crimes. His ability to compartmentalize his twisted desires with his community involvement showed the shocking contrast of what he appeared to be versus the monster he truly was. The execution of Gacy was a moment of relief for many, but it also raised questions about the justice system. His crimes were heinous, and many felt that no matter how much time passed, nothing could undo the damage Gacy had done. His case will forever be tied to the idea of how someone could live a double life, one of a community figure and the other, a violent killer. Gary Gilmore. Gary Gilmore's name became synonymous with the death penalty in the United States. In 1977, he became the first person to be executed after the death penalty was reinstated in the U.S. Following a brief period of a moratorium on capital punishment, Gilmore was sentenced to death for the murder of 2 men during a robbery. His decision to not appeal his sentence and to choose the firing squad as his execution method made him a controversial figure. Gilmore's final meal was simple, consisting of hamburgers, eggs, potatoes, coffee, and whiskey. This basic, almost mundane meal seemed to reflect the simplicity with which he approached death. He didn't seek special treatment or elaborate comfort in his final moments. What made Gilmore's execution particularly significant was his final words, "Let's do it." Those 3 words were not only chilling in their simplicity, but they also became a part of American pop culture. Nike famously adopted the slogan, "Just do it," which was inspired by Gilmore's words. His decision to not fight the system, his acceptance of his fate, and his readiness for death made his execution one of the most talked about in modern history. Gilmore's final moments served as a turning point in the debate about the death penalty in the U.S. His case reignited national conversations about capital punishment and its moral implications. For many, Gilmore's death symbolized the state's power to end a life, but it also posed the question, what is justice? And who truly benefits from such an act? For some, Gilmore's execution was a necessary act of justice, while others questioned whether the death penalty itself could ever be morally justified. Timothy McVeigh. Timothy McVeigh's name is forever tied to one of the deadliest domestic terrorist attacks in U.S. history, the Oklahoma City bombing. In 1995, McVeigh orchestrated an explosion outside the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building, killing 168 people, including 19 children. The bombing was a direct act of domestic terrorism, and McVeigh's actions shocked the nation. In 2001, McVeigh was executed by lethal injection in Indiana. His final meal was 2 pints of mint chocolate chip ice cream, a peculiar choice for a man who had taken so many lives. It was a simple meal that contrasted with the mass destruction he caused. McVeigh spent his last night in prison reading the poem Invictus and watching television, including an episode of The Simpsons. McVeigh's final words were absent. He did not speak before his death, instead opting to write a statement. His silence was a reflection of his belief in his own righteousness. Some believe that McVeigh saw his execution as an act of martyrdom, while others felt his refusal to speak showed his lack of remorse. His execution became one of the most controversial moments in the history of the U.S. death penalty. For the families of the victims, McVeigh's death was a form of justice, but it could not bring back their loved ones. The bombing had caused immeasurable grief, and no punishment could undo the horror McVeigh inflicted. Carl Panzram. Carl Panzram was a man whose life was defined by violence. Known for his brutal murders, arson, and prison killings, Panzram's story is one of extreme cruelty. He confessed to killing over 21 people and raping over 1,000 men. His life was filled with hatred and violence, and he saw the world through a lens of deep anger. In 1930, Panzram was executed by hanging in Indiana. His final meal? None. Panzram famously refused a last meal, choosing instead to face his execution without the comforts that others might seek in their final moments. His last words were defiant, "Hurry it up, you Hoosier bastard." Panzram's words were a final expression of his contempt for the world and the system that had finally caught up with him. Panzram's legacy is one of brutality, but also one of defiance. He wrote a memoir while in prison, in which he expressed his utter lack of faith in mankind. He had no belief in justice, mercy, or even the possibility of redemption. For Panzram, his execution was just another part of a violent world that he had been a part of. His final moments are a stark reminder of how far some individuals can go in their rejection of society and its values. For the families of his victims, Panzram's death was a small measure of justice, but it could never fully erase the violence he had committed. Richard Hickok. Richard Hickok, alongside Perry Smith, is infamous for his role in the brutal 1959 murders of the Clutter family in Holcomb, Kansas. The family, Herb, Bonnie, and their two teenage children, Nancy and Kenyon, were murdered in cold blood as they slept in their home. Hickok and Smith believed the family had a large sum of money in their home, but after the murders, they found only $40. The case became a chilling story that caught the attention of the nation, in part due to Truman Capote's groundbreaking book In Cold Blood, which detailed the crime and its aftermath. Hickok was executed in 1965 by hanging in Kansas. The method of execution, though common at the time, felt especially fitting for someone like Hickok, whose crimes had been carried out with such calculated cruelty. Hickok's final meal was a more traditional one for death row inmates: fried chicken, mashed potatoes, corn, and ice cream. Despite the gravity of his crimes, Hickok's last meal choice seemed somewhat mundane, almost as if he was trying to cling to some sense of normalcy. Hickok's last words were chillingly indifferent: "You people are sending me to a better world." His words suggested little remorse or reflection on the devastation he had caused. The Clutter family's tragic deaths would forever haunt the small Kansas town, and Hickok's cold attitude toward his fate seemed to reflect the complete lack of empathy he had shown his victims. The case of Richard Hickok and Perry Smith stands as one of the most infamous true crime stories in American history. The chilling details of the crime, coupled with Hickok's lack of remorse, made his execution a somber yet necessary act of justice. For the Clutter family's surviving relatives, however, Hickok's execution could never erase the trauma of losing their loved ones in such a senseless and horrific way. Wesley Allen Dodd. Wesley Allen Dodd's crimes were among the most disturbing in American criminal history. Dodd kidnapped, raped, and murdered 3 young boys in the early 1980s. He kept detailed diaries of his torture and abuse, revealing the depths of his depravity. Dodd's crimes were particularly horrifying because they targeted the most vulnerable of victims, young children. and were carried out with a level of sadistic planning that showed no remorse for his actions. Dodd was executed in 1993 by hanging in Washington, making him the last person to be executed by this method in the United States before it was abolished. His choice of hanging, once a common execution method, now seems especially brutal in contrast to modern-day lethal injections. In his final meal, Dodd chose a banana split, fried chicken, fries, and root beer, a strange mix of comfort food and indulgence. Dodd's last words were both chilling and revealing, "Hanging's too good for me." These words seemed to reflect his awareness of his evil actions, yet they also demonstrated a level of self-loathing that was not accompanied by remorse. Dodd had requested a public execution, hoping that the sight of his death would serve as a warning to others, especially potential child predators. In his mind, his public death might prevent future crimes, though many saw it as just a last grasp at notoriety. Wesley Dodd's case sparked significant controversy and debate over the ethics of the death penalty and public executions. His crimes were horrific, and his request for a public execution only highlighted his desire for attention. Yet, despite his horrific actions, some people questioned whether the state should provide him the very thing he wanted most, a public spectacle. For the victims' families, Dodd's death may have provided some closure, but it could never undo the pain he caused. James French. James French's case is one of the most bizarre in the history of the U.S. death penalty. French had been convicted of murdering his cellmate in 1958, but what made his case unique was his desire to be executed. Rather than facing life in prison, French committed the crime of killing his cellmate with the intention of being sentenced to death. He wanted to end his life and believed that being executed would offer him a swift end to his misery. French was executed in 1966 in Oklahoma by electric chair. His last meal, in an unusual twist, was declined, and he refused any comfort or indulgence in his final moments. His last words, however, are among the most memorable and macabre in death row history. "How's this for a headline? French fries." The flippant, almost humorous nature of his statement struck many as deeply inappropriate given the circumstances. What makes James French's case especially odd is that he is considered the only person in U.S. history to successfully achieve suicide by execution. His case raised complex questions about the psychological state of those on death row, and the desire some inmates have for death over life imprisonment. French's execution was a stark reminder of how the death penalty can sometimes be used as a tool to end a person's suffering, but it also highlighted how, for some, the death penalty wasn't about justice, it was a way out. Angel Nieves Diaz. Angel Nieves Diaz was sentenced to death for the murder of a strip club manager, but his execution would go down in history for all the wrong reasons. In 2006, Diaz was executed by lethal injection in Florida, but what should have been a routine process turned into a horrific botched execution. It took a shocking 34 minutes for Diaz to die as the lethal drugs failed to be administered properly. Diaz's execution left him visibly suffering, with the lethal injection causing extreme pain and distress, something that is not supposed to happen. Diaz had declined a final meal, and his last words were a defiant claim of innocence, stating that he was wrongfully convicted and calling his execution a cowardly act. The botched execution led to outrage from human rights groups and even some legal experts, who called for a halt to executions in Florida. Angel Nieves Diaz's case is significant not only because of the botched execution but also because it sparked renewed discussions about the methods used in capital punishment. Diaz's painful death became a symbol of the failures within the execution process, leading Florida to halt executions for over a year as the state reviewed its procedures. For some, Diaz's death was an example of a flawed system, and for others, it raised serious moral questions about the death penalty itself. Ronnie Lee Gardner. Ronnie Lee Gardner's story is one of final defiance and regret. Gardner was convicted of killing 2 people, including a lawyer, during a courthouse escape attempt. In 2010, Gardner's execution took place in Utah, and his choice of execution method, firing squad, marked a rare and unusual way for an inmate to meet their end. The firing squad had not been used in decades, and Gardner's case became a last-minute moment of history, as he was one of the last people to be executed by this method. Gardner's final meal was one of indulgence: lobster tail, steak, apple pie, and vanilla ice cream, a request that seemed to reflect his acceptance of his fate. His last words were, "I do not apologize, but I do have remorse." These words struck a powerful contrast. Gardner admitted remorse for his crimes, but refused to fully apologize for the actions that led to his execution. His death was controversial because of the execution method. For many, the firing squad seemed like an outdated and gruesome form of punishment, yet for others, it was a reminder of the brutality of state-sanctioned death. Gardner's case prompted debates about the future of the death penalty in the U.S., especially when it comes to execution methods and whether they are humane. Robert Gleason Jr. Robert Gleason Jr. earned the grim nickname, the Smiley Face Killer, after committing multiple murders, even while already serving life sentences in prison. Gleason, a man with a history of violence, strangled 2 fellow inmates while locked away, an act that only added to the terror surrounding his name. Before his execution, he taunted police with letters, sending cryptic messages that seemed to mock both law enforcement and the public, further adding to his notoriety. On January 16, 2013, Gleason was executed by lethal injection in Virginia. His final meal request included 2 pepperoni pizzas, 2 root beers, and a bag of peanut M&Ms. A meal fitting for someone who had little regard for anything but his own indulgences. In his final moments, his words reflected his violent nature and refusal to show remorse. "I'd like to say, you can't stop nothing. If I want you dead, you're gonna die. Let's get this over with so I can be on my way." Gleason's death left many feeling unsettled, as his taunting and violent history made it hard to view him as anything other than a cold and calculating criminal. His lack of remorse or reflection during his execution only served to reinforce the darkness of his character, leaving a chilling reminder of the dangers posed by those who thrive on chaos, even from within prison walls. Ricky Ray Rector. Ricky Ray Rector's case is one of the most controversial and heartbreaking in U.S. execution history. Rector was convicted of killing a police officer, but his crime was compounded by a tragic twist during the act. He shot himself in the head, which left him with severe brain damage. This left Rector with the mental capacity of a young child, and his case became a focus of the national debate about the execution of mentally incompetent individuals. Despite the obvious issues with his mental state, Rector was executed by lethal injection in Arkansas on January 24, 1992. His final meal request was a simple slice of pecan pie, which he chose not to eat. In an eerie moment, he reportedly told the guards, "Save it for later." His final words were, "I'd like to thank my family for loving me and taking care of me. And the rest of the world can kiss my ass." What makes this case particularly haunting is the fact that Rector's execution was rushed forward by then-Governor Bill Clinton, who sought to bolster his tough-on-crime stance during his presidential campaign. The execution of an obviously mentally incompetent individual raised serious ethical questions about the death penalty, especially in cases where the person's mental condition could not fully be understood. The world was left grappling with the morality of executing someone like Rector, whose mental state seemed to make him incapable of fully understanding the nature of his crimes or the punishment he was receiving. Thomas J. Grasso. Thomas J. Grasso's story is one of a man who escalated from robbery to brutal murder. Grasso strangled two elderly women, one for a mere $18. The chilling nature of his crimes showed how far he would go for little reward, a stark reminder of the randomness of violence. His most notorious act was the murder of an elderly woman in her own home, a crime that showed a total disregard for life. Grasso was executed on March 20, 1995, by lethal injection in Oklahoma. His final meal request was a peculiar one: 2 dozen steamed mussels, 2 dozen clams, a double cheeseburger from Burger King, half a pumpkin pie with whipped cream, and a strawberry milkshake. It was an unusual mix of fast food and seafood, but what made his last meal infamous was his final words. Grasso dramatically declared, "I did not get my SpaghettiOs. I got spaghetti. I want the press to know this." His request for SpaghettiOs, a seemingly trivial concern in the face of his brutal crimes, gave a bizarre and somewhat comedic tone to his final moments. Grasso's last words were more than just an oddity, they were a symbol of the man's personality. His actions had caused immense pain, yet his focus was on something as trivial as food, leaving a chilling disconnect between his final moments and the reality of his horrific crimes. Ted Kaczynski. Ted Kaczynski, also known as the Unabomber, became infamous for his mail bombings that targeted universities and airlines. Over the course of 17 years, Kaczynski's campaign of terror left 3 people dead and 23 others injured. His meticulously crafted bombs were designed to spread fear and force society to pay attention to his manifesto, which railed against modern technology and the impact of industrialization on human life. While Kaczynski was not executed, his case is noteworthy for its profound impact on the true crime world. He died in prison on June 10, 2023, having taken his own life. Before his death, Kaczynski lived out his days in solitary confinement, isolated from the outside world as he served his sentence for his domestic terrorism. No last meal was requested, as his death was not tied to execution but to suicide. Kaczynski's story raises questions about justice and punishment in the case of domestic terrorism. He became one of the most infamous criminals in U.S. history, not just for his violent acts but also for his philosophical convictions, which he believed justified his killings. His legacy is marked by the trauma he caused and the chilling realization that a man capable of such violence was also deeply committed to his controversial beliefs. Stephen Judy. Stephen Judy's crimes were some of the most tragic and senseless in the realm of true crime. Judy brutally raped and murdered a young mother, then proceeded to drown her 3 children in a river, showing the complete disregard he had for human life, especially the lives of innocent children. His actions were so shocking that they left an indelible mark on Indiana's history. Judy was executed by electric chair on March 9, 1981, in Indiana. His final meal was a standard prison tray, as he declined a special meal request. His last words were chilling, "It's been a lot of fun. I'd like to thank the prosecutor and my attorneys for all they've done. Let's get this over with." His words revealed a total lack of remorse, and even more disturbingly, he seemed to make light of the gravity of his actions. In his final moments, Judy showed no emotion or reflection on the horror he had caused. Judy's death was a sobering reminder of the brutal crimes that some individuals are capable of. His coldness and inability to show remorse left many questioning the effectiveness of the justice system in addressing the depth of human cruelty. Despite his final words, the true victims of Judy's crimes, his helpless victims, remained in the minds of those who remembered the tragedy he caused. The final meals have been served. The last statements recorded. These executions marked the end of some of America's most notorious criminal cases, yet they remain significant historical moments that continue to provoke discussion about justice, punishment, and human nature. Each case represents a complex intersection of law, psychology, and society's evolving standards. From their choices in final meals to their parting words, these executions provide unique insights into our criminal justice system. For more historical examinations of significant legal cases and their lasting impacts, subscribe to stay updated on our ongoing research and analysis. We continue exploring how society addresses its most challenging questions about crime and punishment. Turn on notifications to join the conversation as we examine these important chapters in American history with thoughtful perspective and factual accuracy.